Well, welcome everybody. This is our last session of the week here at the Saskatchewan Waste Reduction Council's 2020 Waste Reform, prior to one last networking session at the end there. And it's been a pretty busy week, a little bit of a different flavor. We're looking at it on computer screens instead of seeing everybody at home. So I work for the City of Saskatoon. I'm a project manager, and I also sit on the board of the Saskatchewan Waste Reduction Council. I've been on the board for 1 year, and I primarily work on waste diversion initiatives with the city. I work with our sustainability group. Hi, Jeff. And I'll be working on waste diversion with businesses and organizations over the next few years. So a little bit about myself. I would also just like to acknowledge K-Lite Recycling as the sponsor of this session. K-Lite is based out of Regina. I've worked with them on a number of initiatives. They're always great to work with, so we appreciate their support. So first up, we have Jim Puckett. Jim is the executive director and founder of the Basel Action Network. He has been an environmental health and justice advocate for 28 years. He has served as Greenpeace International's toxic director based in Amsterdam, Netherlands, where his campaign was instrumental in achieving the ban amendment to the UN Basel Convention, as well as numerous regional waste trade bans. He has represented civil society within the Basel Convention since its inception in 1989. Campaigning against all forms of toxic trade, he has traveled extensively, researching, writing, and producing films. So, Jim, take it away.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ben. Can you see my full screen there then?
Yeah.
All right. So first we want to talk about why waste moves across borders. And it turns out it moves for the very same reason any pollution happens. And that is basically cost externalization. It's an economic concept, but it's really what's behind all forms of pollution and a lot of human rights abuses. And a lot of the problems of our world is we don't have a true economic system. We have cost externalities happening all the time, and people can profit from them, and that's what creates so many problems. So what is a cost externalization? It's a market distortion where an action that negatively impacts others, nature, or the global commons results in a cost that is not paid by the actor, either to prevent it in the first place or to compensate for the negative impacts of that cost. So that's a lot of words. I think you understand what it's all about. The true cost of making something is greater than the market price. So someone else is bearing the costs, either through harm to them or what have you. And so throughout history, those that extract resources, use resources, and harness technology seldom have to pay or charge the actual true costs that account for all their activities. And if we look at the history of waste management and the attempts to try to internalize costs from cost externalization, we see the following. That's a factory there. That's my strange drawing. And you can see that the first thing that people did with their waste was they throw it out in the back dump. And there were public nuisance laws that tried to control that. But that was the first thing, and people didn't like it. It's smelly, it was terrible. So then they started thinking, well, we could just burn this waste in the factory and let it go out the air pipe, the smokestack. And then later they said, well, we can also, because people were complaining about the smoke downwind, we could put it in the rivers. We just put a discharge pipe and put it in the lakes and the rivers, and that was done as well. Later, there was efforts even to use the seas, the oceans, as a waste dump. So every time these activities were undertaken, people got upset. They were all about finding ways to have people pay for the damage than having you have to do it yourself, having to take care of it yourself. And so there was an effort to internalize the costs through regulation. So, for example, in the United States, we had public nuisance laws that made it forbidden to put things out in the back dumps. We had the Clean Air Act to stop people from using smokestacks to get rid of their material. We had the Clean Water Act to protect the rivers and lakes. And then the global stage, we had the London Dumping Convention to stop the dumping of industrial waste. And so every time we were closing off these avenues, making it very expensive to do that through legislation, the last avenue that was left, and one that we're dealing with today still, of course, is externalization via export, via exploitation of developing countries that lack regulation. And that's why waste moves across borders for the most part. Not always, but for the most part. And not only does externalization happen at the end of the life cycle of products, but of course it happens at the front end too of the life cycle. So the global south, which is represented on the left here, does a lot of this extraction, very harmful mining, etc., forest products, etc., very harmful to the environment. We get the products in the global north on the right, and they come back as waste to the global south. So the global south has a disproportionate burden of the harm, is the way it's worked out. Now, you can look at that thing and say, oh my God, that's kind of like a circle, but I want to emphasize this is not the circular economy we're talking about. This type of movement is very linear. When the waste goes to the global south, it stays there for the most part, and there's no circularity whatsoever. So this is the situation. It's not a pretty picture. Pollution and labor abuse follows a path of greatest opportunity for cost externalization. And cost externalization competes with and undermines all efforts to achieve a proper circular economy. So that's why it's moving, and the drivers of this are the lack of accountability under certain scenarios. For example, when you put something in the global commons, who has governance over it? So that's a driver, using the global commons, the air and the seas. The lack of democracy, empowerment in certain parts of the world give people the lack of ability to address damage done to them. And the third one, probably the largest and biggest driver, is global inequity. So this ensures that labor cost disparities are really pronounced and provides cheap labor. And cheap labor in a weak economy often accompanies lack of societal safety nets and protections in those weaker economies. So just to talk, we're not on a level playing field here, and this is the problem. This is why waste moves. It's not a level playing field. It's a messy, crazy playing field. And when we look at global inequity, the issue, you can look at this chart, and all the blue and yellow and greens are the richer countries, and the reds and oranges are the poorer countries per capita, GDP per capita. And you can see that indeed there is a swath of countries that actually has a geographic distribution, which is why we talk about the global south and the global north. There really is a band of inequity, and this causes things, commodities and waste, to move in and out of that band to try to exploit the weaker economies. So we have a lot of movement of goods and waste that is really unnecessary were it not for this inequity. If we had an equal planet where everyone was relatively as wealthy as each other, we would not have this crazy movement of mass shipping that we have. So that is it's pretty shocking. And what's really more shocking, of course, is that it's getting worse. Over time, we see just the inequity is getting worse and worse. The middle class is shrinking everywhere. Half of the world's wealth now is in the hands of 1% of the population. World's 26 richest people own as much as the poorest 50%. So this is actually, this is not a good representation of an uneven playing field. It's more like this. And this is what the Basel Convention was there to address. And sadly, it's getting worse. So the Basel Convention is a treaty. It's the world's only waste treaty focused on waste that came about due to the fact that in the late 1980s, all those regulatory measures to internalize costs started really tackling hazardous waste and saying, oh, wow, you can't just dump that anywhere. You have to take it to a hazardous waste landfill, or a very fancy incinerator, what have you, and it increased the cost tremendously. And so people trying to avoid that cost and externalize those costs looked to the export markets. And so in the late 1980s, we had many, many scandals of developed countries dumping their waste on developing countries. And this is how the Basel Convention was born, to address this transboundary issue. It was finished in 1989, and today it has 187 parties, so it really has good saturation on the planet. We've been involved as band since 1997, and I personally have been involved before that when I was with Greenpeace since 1989, since the inception. So what does Basel do? Just some basics so we can get into what are the latest things that have happened that will impact you all. What it does, primarily, it has a soft law component and a hard law component. Soft law is general obligations. You're not going to get arrested for not following them, but they're the basic principles. And it calls for national self-sufficiency in waste management. So every country should take care of their own waste. It calls for minimizing, therefore, all forms of transboundary movement of hazardous and other wastes. And it calls for minimizing the generation of hazardous and other wastes. It calls for ensuring environmentally sound management of that which is produced. So if you can't eliminate the generation, you have to manage it in an environmentally sound manner, and they define what that is. What does the hard law part of it do? This is where you have criminality, perhaps. This is where the hard law comes in, where people can be prosecuted, and it's all about the trade rules. So first thing they do, they define what we're talking about. They define hazardous waste and other wastes, and it's done by annexes of listing actual hazardous characteristics and actual constituents. And it's also done by defining that any country has the right to declare something as a hazardous waste. So national definitions have to be respected. And then there's another category, which is called other waste, or waste for special consideration, and that's Annex 2. Until very recently, it had only 2 entries. It had waste collected from households, so household garbage, and it had incinerator ash from incinerating that same material. And now, very recently, and we'll talk about this, of course, they have included in this annex various types of plastic waste for the first time. So what happens with those definitions is that controls, trade controls are required, and those fall into 2 categories. The default control is a notification and consent procedure. So before you can export a waste to somebody that's on those lists, you have to get their consent, and you have to notify them and then get that consent. And that's called prior informed consent, or PIC. And without this procedure, it's considered illegal traffic. And then there's also prohibitions, and these are becoming, they're increasing over time, as we will see. First of all, countries can ban imports on a national basis, as China did, as we're very aware, with lots of types of scrap and waste. They just put up an import ban, and that's protected under the Basel Convention. So it'd be very difficult to challenge China under the WTO, because Basel says you have the right to do that. And there's also a ban on exporting anything to Antarctica. And there is a ban also between parties and non-parties. And there's an exception to that, which is an Article 11 agreement. But the reason this one becomes very relevant is the US, the most wasteful country in the world per capita, is not part of the convention. So they're a non-party. So a lot of the trade between parties and non-parties, trade between parties in the US can't happen unless it's done via an Article 11 agreement. And then most recently, last year in December, the Basel Ban Amendment, which my organization has worked on for years, and prior to that, Greenpeace, has finally come into force, and we'll talk about that. So there are now 187 Basel country members of the 193, so that leaves just 6 countries out: East Timor, Grenada, Haiti, San Marino, South Sudan, Tuvalu, and the US. So the US obviously is a very glaring omission to this convention. In the beginning, the Basel Convention was covering factory waste, production waste. It was not covering post-consumer waste. That has changed. Now post-consumer waste is the most traded hazardous waste, and e-waste is right up there at the top of the list. Also, old ships are a big hot topic in this global trade of hazardous waste that's going on today. So obsolete vessels are going to India, for example, and dumped on the beaches there and taken apart by hand, basically with some very impoverished community workers. And the real hot topic today is plastic waste trade. And most of that now is going to Southeast Asia because China said no more. So real quickly on the ban amendment, the convention itself was meant to have a ban in it. I mean, almost everybody that was involved in negotiating it thought that the final destination for this activity was to have a prohibition from exporting from developed to developing countries for any reason. And of course, by the nature of international law, it is done by consensus. And so the initial convention was not including that ban, but it did have the prior informed consent procedure. And Greenpeace at the time condemned the convention for that weakness, saying we needed to have a ban. And the African group walked out. Many regions, such as Africa, to their credit, they didn't just walk out and protest, they created their own regional bans. So there's a convention in Africa called the Bamako Convention, which bans all hazardous waste coming into Africa, for example. South Pacific did the same, Mediterranean region did the same. So in 1994, a few years after the convention was adopted, 5 years later, and the convention itself came into force, at the second meeting, a ban was proposed by the group of 77 developing countries in China. Europe joined in and it passed. But then the detractors of the ban said, well, this is just a decision. It's not really changing the treaty. So we had to come back the next year in 1995 at the next conference of parties, the third conference of parties, and pass a ban amendment. Both of these decisions happened by consensus, but passing the amendment did not mean, of course, that it went into force. You had to then collect the ratifications necessary. And we've been in that process for how many years? Since 95 till now. So that's, 24 years that we have been working. And last December, it finally got the requisite number of ratifications to enter into force of law. So the ban amendment is now part of the convention, part and parcel of it. So what does the Basel ban do? And what does it not do? It creates a list on Annex 7 of developed countries. It's made up of the EU and the OECD and Liechtenstein. That's what's on Annex 7. And they're forbidden from exporting their hazardous waste to any countries not on that list. That's the ban in a nutshell. It does not prohibit trade from non-Annex 7 countries, developing countries, to other countries. And it does not prohibit trade between Annex 7 countries, like between Canada and the US. So that's the Basel ban. Now, facts about it. Again, as of December 5th, the convention is totally changed. It has a new annex, it has a new Article 4A, and it has a new preambular paragraph explaining the motivation for the ban. When the US finally ratifies the convention, and we are pretty sure someday they will now have to accept the ban because it's part of the convention. Currently, 99 out of 187 Basel parties have ratified it, the ban amendment. So for those that ratified the convention before the ban became part of it, they don't have to accept the ban. So we have to count them. There's 99 of them and growing. So technically, it only applies to those that have ratified the ban. Canada has not. But all parties must respect other Basel Party ratifications. So, for example, Canada can now not export to Indonesia. Indonesia has ratified the ban. Canada has not. Now, the ban does not control the other waste category. It only controls the hazardous waste category. And so that's important because the plastics additions are on Annex 2. So normally those would not be accompanied in the ban. They would merely need to have the prior informed consent mechanism applied. There's 41 countries on Annex 7. If you take all the OECD and the EU and Liechtenstein together, 33 of them have ratified it. So that's a very important number. That's the gang of countries that have obligations under the ban, and the majority have agreed to it. So this is the list. Take a look. You see the green there. Those are the countries in Annex 7 that have ratified the ban. And then we have in the yellow, Canada has not, Australia has not, Japan has not. They've ratified the convention, but not the ban amendment. And then you have the US, the renegade country down there in the right corner, has done neither. No convention, no ban amendment, not playing, not good team player in the global stage. The effect of the Basel ban in internalizing costs is very important. Basically, what I was talking about with cost externalization, we put up a wall. So it's an internalization by a regulation, similar to the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, etc. But this is for international trade. And it has that great aspect to it of affecting the downstream immediately. So it protects people from this gross exploitation of hazardous waste. But the upstream impacts of internalization are profound. So it provides a strong new economic and legal incentive to implement waste prevention and green design at source. Instead of getting rid of your problems by dumping them on others, you solve them upstream. So much more efficient to do it that way. So if you want more information on the ban amendment, go to our ban.org library, and there's a document there where you can read all about it. Next, I want to talk to you about something very timely and pertinent to you all, and that is the new controls that are going to be required for plastics. These just came about last year also. They were much quicker in being formulated because in the convention you can change annexes and amend annexes really quickly. You can't do that with treaty text. So it took 24 years to put treaty text in place. It took like 15 months to get these ban amendments in place. They were necessary for two reasons, two things that have happened on planet Earth. The national sword, which I talked about, with China banning all their imports. They used to take the lion's share of the world's plastic waste that was tradable. And they put up a virtual ban. They required a purity level of 99.5% of polymers. And so that was a virtual ban. Nobody could achieve that. And so that created a chaotic situation, a waste circus globally, and things started moving all over the place. So we had real chaos. We had countries that were getting hit with what used to go to China, and they were not happy about it. Basel took notice. Here you have a graphic representation of what happened before and after the China ban. In the left-hand column, in each column you have a left and right also, where you can see where the waste was exported from and who was importing it. And you can see all that blue there on the right of the first column was China, because Hong Kong, of course, is part of China. So they were getting a massive amount. And then they said no, and now they're getting a trickle. And so as of 2018, everything has shifted, and things are going to Malaysia, Vietnam, India, Taiwan, Indonesia, Turkey, Thailand, you name it. It's very fluid still. And this probably was instigated by one of the more influential unknown films of the world called Plastic China. This was a documentary created by a Chinese guy who was really sick of seeing communities, his own family community where he grew up, inundated with this mixed plastic waste, which could not be well recycled, and only a tiny fraction of it was being recycled. The rest of it was just being dumped and burned. He did a very human-oriented film about those communities, and that film was banned in China. Right after it was shown, it was banned, and then 2 weeks later, this policy, National Sword, was enacted, and no more could this waste come to China. So I think the film did have quite an impact. But then, of course, you have the whack-a-mole problem. You whack it in China, the Chinese industry, the businessmen went down to Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, paid off the locals, paid off governments, etc., and said, we want to set up business here. And they started moving the waste to these facilities in those countries. And this is the situation we're still in. The good news is those countries are now really protesting and erecting their own prohibitions, and probably are going to be incentivized to do the same exact prohibitions that China has done. So there's no more of this, pathway, the lowest common denominator, which they're being victimized by. So much of this waste, as I said, is not recyclable because it's mixed and only certain fractions can be dealt with. And so much of it is being burned, and it's horrifically harmful to do that, as you know. So this is some of the pictures that from Malaysia, and give you an idea. There's many documents now and documentaries that have shown the horrific effects of the boomerang effect of things that used to go to China where they end up now. So that was one of the instigators, one of the reasons why Basel took action. The other thing that's happened on the planet is we've realized what a horrific situation we're in with marine pollution by plastics. And this has gotten so much attention on the global stage and international fora. And this idea of marine debris, of having to tackle that so we have more fish than plastics in the ocean, and we're not killing our protein source and our seas that are so vital to us via plastic pollution, has another major motivator. And then finally, well, here's some pictures just to remind ourselves of the horrors that we have learned about. And finally, we had in our tool, people saying, what are we going to do about plastics? What are we going to do about marine debris? Well, we had a convention in our toolbox already. We had something, and that was the Basel Convention. We didn't have to create a new treaty immediately because we have this one we can use now. The new treaty is in the works, very likely to happen, being worked on at the global level. But Basel was there and ready, and the Norwegians took up the mantle and said, we want to do something now to provide greater transparency, which Basel provides with its notification procedure, and also to require environmentally sound management of that which moves. So here's the big meeting. It happened last year at COP14. All these little specks are delegates. I'm one of those little specks. And again, it was pretty dramatic how quickly this moved and how such widespread support for it allowed us to adopt it right then and there. At one COP only. Usually things take several meetings to get done. So here's the gang that instigated it, the Norwegian delegation. We worked with them, of course. And there were a lot of advocates, however. The African group was in solidarity, the Asian Pacific countries, remarkably so. The EU came on board right away. And even Japan, which usually stays out of these kind of things, was a co-sponsor. And interestingly, the strongest position of all was held by China. China said, we want all plastic waste to have prior informed consent, not just the mixed and dirty ones, which is what ended up being adopted. But they said all. So the NGO community was there in force, and we are in this picture announcing a petition that had, at that point, over 600,000 people saying support the Norwegian amendment. It got to be over 1 million by the end of the meeting. The opponents of it were very few. The US opposed it, the American Chemistry Council opposed it, the scrap recycling industries opposed it. So a lot of industry bodies, not all of them, but a lot of them were in opposition, and they promoted their opposition via Argentina and Brazil's position. And those two countries were the only parties that were vocal against it. They were mollified in the end, and it was adopted by consensus with very few changes to what was proposed. So the intention of these amendments is to ensure control and transparency for movements of plastic waste, which are not likely to be recycled mechanically, or in a proper way. Plastic waste mixtures other than one particular mixture are now going to be controlled. Contaminated plastic waste with a very strict definition of what contaminated means. So it has to be almost exclusively that one polymer. So anything that's extraneous to that is going to be a problem. And they also wanted to control halogenated polymers like PVC. So these are the things that are now being picked up under Annex 2, and that will require the prior informed consent that I talked about. It'll also require assurance of environmentally sound management, and it will also trigger illegal traffic and criminal activity and prosecutions if somebody fails to provide, for example, that prior informed consent. So what changes really? Before, no country really was controlling plastic waste trade. We had no specific listings on hazardous waste list. We had some plastic waste listed as non-hazardous, but we had no plastics on Annex 2 unless it was part of the waste collected from households category. And now this will all go into force in January of 2021. So this is what's coming. This is what everyone in Canada and the US, hopefully in the US, will have to adapt to or adopt and change their industries and change their municipal collection systems, etc. So this is the impact, is that there's going to be new plastic listings on the hazardous waste list, Annex 8. That impact will be small because there's going to be very few listings there. It'll have to be something very contaminated. The non-hazardous waste list, Annex 9, will be strengthened, and there will be no controls required there. That impact is small to medium. But the big impact is the new listing for everything else. It's the catch-all. If you're not in Annex 8 and you're not in Annex 9, then you're going to be caught in Annex 2. And that will require prior informed consent. In some places in the world, like the EU, that will mean a ban, because the EU has uniquely banned Annex 2 going to developing countries. So the impact will be really big. The 4 categories that are exempt, that are on the non-hazardous list, as long as they're going to mechanical recycling and not any other form of recycling like incineration or chemical recycling, they are the following. Plastic waste almost exclusively consisting of one non-halogenated polymer. Non-halogenated is no PVC, but what we're talking about is all PE, polyethylene, all polypropylene, all PET, all in one bale together. You can't have them mixed anymore, with one exception, which I'll cover at the very end. Second category is plastic waste almost exclusively consisting of one cured resin or condensation product like urea formaldehyde, but it's got to be really clean. The third, and it's got to be separated. The third is plastic waste almost exclusively consisting of one of a short list of fluorinated polymers like PFA. That again has to be separated per polymer, not mixed with other fluorinateds, and it has to be clean. And then finally, they allowed one mixture, which is a mixture of PE, PP, and PET, provided they are destined for separate recycling and are free from contamination and other types of waste. So those are the only categories now which will not be controlled by prior informed consent or a prohibition under Basel. Anything other than those 4 will be controlled. Hazardous waste will be controlled under Annex 8, and Annex 2 is what the big change was. That'll be most mixed and contaminated plastic scrap. So the lion's share of what we've been trading across borders from our municipal waste collection facilities has been mixed and dirty material. So this means everything has to change. The legality for countries around the world, from a Basel party to another Basel party, yes, you can do it, but it's going to require prior informed consent. And from the OECD to the OECD, yes, you can do it under the OECD prior informed consent regime, which is a little more flexible. There is some question is whether the U.S. is going to want to go along with the OECD. That's being worked out as we speak, because the U.S. stood alone as saying they didn't agree to these new plastic amendments. Of all the OECD countries, they couldn't agree to them. So we have a special case with the U.S. and with the EU. The U.S. being a non-party, when they're going to other OECD countries, they can do it via PIC. If the U.S. is trading with another non-party, which there's very few of, like Haiti, they can do it with no controls. But the big one at the bottom there is the U.S. being a non-party to the convention cannot trade with Basel parties that are not part of the OECD. It's going to be criminal trafficking. It'll not be allowed somewhere on the chain. So the trade will need to stop if it's going to be legal trade. And then we have another special case with the EU. Now the EU has disappointed us by saying, well, we're not going to apply these new definitions in the internal market of the EU. So if it's from an EU country to another EU country, they're going to say, we're going to keep the status quo. You don't have to have notification and consent. We're really complaining about that. It's not a done deal yet. And then the EU, to other non-Annex 7, so to developing countries, they've forbidden it. Even if it's on Annex 2, they've forbidden it to their credit. And then the EU, if they're going to another OECD country, they have to do it via the OECD PIC procedure, like UK or Turkey. So it's a little complicated. And if you are a recycler or a municipality, the complications can overwhelm you. So we created a flow chart. You can find it on our website that gives you the implications of the Norwegian amendments. You can, have plastic waste come at the top. You can learn through this flow chart what you need to do to decide how it should be moving. So to summarize, as a result of National Sword, China is still off limits. They've even made things more strict. They've gotten rid of the 0.5%. So now it has to be pure. So they're serious. They're not only putting it in place, but they're enforcing it really well. And then many Chinese businesses, as I said, have moved their operations to Southeast Asia. And US and Canadian brokers are continuing to export to these facilities right now. And that has got to change. Certainly for Canada, which is a Basel party, they can't keep doing it the same way. But there's pressure in these countries to turn back containers which are not clean, and this is going to increase once these amendments kick into force on January 1 of next year. So, and as a result of these amendments, in U.S. and Canadian municipalities, all exports to non-OECD countries will require trading partners to engage in illegal imports. And in Canada, you'll be having exporters that could be prosecuted as well. So it's a big change. And despite the U.S. protests at the OECD, they're likely to have to use the OECD PIC procedure also. In order to continue to pursue foreign markets, although these are diminishing, they're going to have to change. People are going to have to change things. It's going to have to mean that in-country separation of polymers and cleaning takes place prior to export, or alternatively, you deal with the recycling at home. You don't export anymore. You start developing infrastructure to manage this plastic material at home, as was the original intent of the convention. And if separation and cleaning is done in Mexico, I think Mexico is still going to require prior informed consent, but Mexico is an OECD country which we fear will be targeted for a lot of this waste. So what the future might hold: expect more markets in Asia to dry up due to pollution there and the political pressures to mimic China's ban. The price of scrap plastic, it's difficult to predict it, but it looks very much like the price is just going to keep plummeting. The new fracking that's taking place is making virgin plastic prices go down. The price of oil and gas is going down constantly. So unless there's real strict requirements for more post-consumer content, the demand for this waste is is just going to disappear, and it's very, very scary for recycling and collection. Larger recycling companies are looking at that and they're saying, should we really invest in recycling through domestic separation in Canada, for example, and domestic recycling if indeed we're going to be outcompeted with virgin plastic? So what's going to happen, I think, in the near term, sadly, is that in the midterm, many plastics will continue to be exported, perhaps illegally, to substandard operations. They more and more will be incinerated and landfilled because they just don't have anything else. And increasingly, from a policy perspective, I think plastics will be seen as poorly suited to a circular economy. It's not really circular due to the deterioration of polymer chains, so you're always downcycling, due to the hazardous additives that nobody talks about, and due to the climate impacts if you're going to go and incinerate it for energy. For those reasons, I think in places where they're ahead of the game, like in Brussels, they're saying plastics is not suited to a circular economy. So that's my deep dive for you today. I hope it was helpful, and I'll take any questions at the proper time.
Great, thank you, Jim. That's very enlightening. I think we all have some sort of a story of the impact on the national sword in China. So I'm really curious to see where these future changes take us in terms of impact on local recycling. But without further ado, I'd like to jump over to Bill. We'll take questions, as I said, at the end and can potentially move them over to our networking session. So Bill Moore is president of Moore & Associates, an international consulting firm that provides a range of strategic services and research to global recycling organizations. Bill has a 40-year career as an environmental business professional. Prior to establishing his own consulting firm, Bill held a series of positions in the chemical, solid waste, paper, and recycling industries. This included Director of Recycling for Waste Management, Inc., where he was responsible for the startup of the Recycle America program, the largest introduction of recycling services in the United States. Bill's unique knowledge base includes all aspects of the global supply chain, of global supply and demand of recovered paper, where he is currently considered the leading expert. All right, Bill,
Thank you,
go ahead.
So do we have my full screen up presentation? Does it look good?
Yeah, looks good.
Well, thanks for that. Thanks for that introduction. And Moore & Associates is pretty well known in the paper recycling area, working around the world, do a substantial amount of work in Canada, the US, Europe, and Asia. So we're going to take a look at the global picture of RCP, which is the acronym for recovered paper, by product grade. And you can see over the 11-year period from 2008 to 2018, we used another 41 million tons, metric tons of paper. And case materials, which is the global term for corrugated boxes, you can see that there was not only that increase in tonnage, but in terms of share of recovered paper, a lot more was going into corrugated boxes. And you can see it's primarily at the expense of newsprint, which the usage fell in half. Tissue about held its own. Printing and writing papers also decreased the use of recycled fiber over that time frame. So if we take a look at this 22-year chart, which shows the global recovered paper demand by grade, it's easy to pick out the blue line of OCC, old corrugated containers, going up steadily. And all the other grade categories, mixed paper, high grades, and ONP, newspapers and magazines, kind of down near the bottom, stuck in a bit of a trading range, although it's clear to see that the ONP usage is going down, the old newspaper usage is going down. And if I expand the scale a little bit, we see that mixed paper demand is actually starting to tick up pretty rapidly. So if we look at the recovered paper net exports from the developed world from the late 90s through about 2011, you can see there was a fair amount of growth in exports from all the developed economies, again, primarily going to China. But this has really flattened out for 8 or 9 years now, even prior to National Sword. Europe's exports have gone down a little bit, and North America has been basically flat for 8 or 9 years. So there's been a global shift in the recovered paper markets. In 2016, China imported 29 million tons of recovered paper from all around the world. And in 2017, China announced their reduction of imported RCP. And a total ban of all imported RCP is in place for January of next year. India, Taiwan, Japan, Thailand, and other Asian companies have ramped up their recovered paper consumption since 2017, particularly in Southeast Asia. And combined, though, their volume usage is less than half of what China's recovered paper consumption was. The largest Chinese paper companies are investing in mills in other Asian countries and the US to produce both paper and recycled fiber pulp to access needed fiber. If we look at 2018 for specifically OCC, old corrugated containers, you can see on the blue chart on the right, the bar chart, you can see 2018 versus 17, how things changed dramatically. China bought everywhere in the world, and 18 was down quite a bit from 17. So what has China been doing to get its fiber? The one aspect that was a cornerstone of their policy was to increase the domestic collection of recovered paper, and that has indeed happened, the domestic collection of the bars, the blue bars at the bottom. And you can see how the imports, which grew for about 15 years, leveled off for about 4 or 5 years, have dramatically decreased in the last 3 years. And if you look at US recovered paper exports to China, considering a base year of 2015 or 16 at around 15 million tons, last year the US exported less than 6 million tons, and we estimate 4.2 million this year and 0 in 21. So this somewhat busy and volatile slide is what we call the recovered paper price ticker. And it's a basket of all representative grades of recovered paper, mixed paper, some OMP grades, some OCC, and some high grades. And I won't go through this hugely, but China was buying heavily up until March of 17. And after their import restrictions kicked in, the basket price fell down to lost $35 a ton within 6 months. And the next year from 17 through 18, although the entire ticker went up, it was primarily because high grade prices went up. Bulk grades decreased, mixed paper, OCC, and OMP. And then starting in early 19, we had a deep slide and a sharp decline in all grades, which continued until January of 20, where we bottomed out at half the value of the basket that it was in March of 17. 2019 was not a pretty year in the paper recovery business. But the market started to turn by its own forces in early 2020. And then when the coronavirus effect kicked in and commercial collections really shut down quite a bit, supply tightened up, demand was reasonable, and prices slingshot from $93 in January up to $143 in May. And then we've had some correction after the market overheated, and the basket as of July was down to $123. So this is a nice long-term chart over 30 years of OCC, and you can see how bad 2019 was at $42 US a short ton. It took us all the way back to where we were in 1992 and 93. And you can see some of the peaks, the 160 and 95 was a historic high up to that point. And China was not in the market. China came in the market in around the late 90s, and they really caused those peaks, the 137 and 7 and the 177 and 169. And when they backed out of the OCC market, that's where things went down in 2019, 18 and 19. And then we had a rebound in the first half of 20 up to $70 a ton. So mixed paper, which was particularly hard hit by China's stopping imports of that grade, you can see the trend line here was downward, the red trend line. And when China was buying heavily, like in 2011, the price of mixed paper was $127 a ton. And then we were kind of in a trading range from 2012 to 16 in the $60 or so range, bumped up again to 80s when China started buying. And then the import bans took hold in 17, and pricing fell from $83 down to minus $5 in the second half of 19. And we had a little bit of rebound in the first half of 20 up to $10 a ton. So there's a lot of activity around the world for new recycled fiber-based containerboard mills. The good news on e-commerce is it's increased the demand for corrugated boxes, and the fiber of choice to produce corrugated boxes is OCC and mixed paper. And I won't go through all of these, but you can see the Pacific Northwest has a lot of new projects, some of which have already started, and there's more to come there. And also the upper Midwest, Minnesota and Wisconsin have a couple of projects, and you can see their projects distributed throughout the U.S. On the newspaper side of the business, it's almost become irrelevant. The global newspaper consumption fell from a peak of 38 million metric tons of newsprint use in 06 down to less than 20 million tons in 18, and it's dropping even faster. And one of the coronavirus impacts is that newspaper readership has declined even more. And in comparison to North America, Europe and Asia still use a fairly high percentage of recycled fiber in their newsprint production due to higher electricity and wood costs. At its peak, the US and Canada had 30 recycled newsprint mills in 1998. There's only one left in North America. Carton board or box board, gray box board, uses some newsprint in its production, and that's kind of disconnected with newsprint supply. Once you use ONP in box board, you can't get it back again. And the supply short nature of high quality recovered newspaper grades will keep pricing at the bottom cycle up higher than historical performance. And that structural decline in newsprint is now going all around the world. Even in places like India, which was one of the last bastions of newspaper readership, is now declining. And I mentioned that the coronavirus has caused a permanent further decline. And there's huge overcapacity in all the developed markets, and significant capacity reductions are occurring in Europe, in the US, and in Canada. And these mills are being repositioned to produce OCC-based containerboard. And with the declining newsprint supply and the increased worldwide recycled mill capacity for use of newspapers, but it's not in newsprint, it's primarily paperboard. And here's a price chart over 13 years of the newspaper grades, the old number 8 grade, and the grade that replaced it, number 56, sorted residential paper and news. You can see the price trend was clearly downward. Looks a lot like mixed paper pricing, with the bottom in the second half of 2010 at $10 and a small rebound in the first half of 20. Switching over to the high grades, and recovered fiber use in tissue has actually been declining globally. From the peak in around 2000 at 51% of global tissue being produced from recycle, we've slipped down to about 35%. At the expense of chemical pulp, primarily tropical hardwoods being used as virgin fiber to produce tissue. But it's still a substantial amount of recycled fiber in tissue. But one of the reasons why the use is declining is that uncoated free sheet, UFS, think office papers, bond papers, the use of those papers is declining rapidly. And you can see that in the North American stats. The top amber brownish bars are going down rapidly, where SOP consumption is going down a little bit, but not quite so much. And that's one reason why prices really jumped up for office papers in the second quarter of this year, because uncoated free sheet use went down greatly and the tissue business kind of held its own. So recycled fiber market pulp, RCF pulp as we call it, uses recovered paper to produce dried, baled, or rolls ready for shipment. And it's a new grade of pulp that didn't exist before 2017. And China is the main user because they're short of fiber. It's still a small market, but growing rapidly. It's about 1.5 million metric tons a year globally. And in comparison, unbleached virgin kraft pulp is about 3 million tons. Bleached pulp is about 25 million tons. And there are multiple grades of RCF pulp. There's brown pulp, mostly made from OCC, which is going into containerboard. And then gray pulp, which is more made from mixed paper and some OCC, which is used in boxboard. And you can see the Chinese mill companies have come to the U.S. And building recycled fiber pulp mills primarily in the Northeast U.S. The Old Town main mill is a virgin fiber one, and I just kept that on because it's the same company. The Chinese companies have invested in the U.S., nothing in Canada to date, nothing in Europe, but they've had large investments in Southeast Asia. So there are other planned North American recycled fiber pulp mills. K-Mean Sustainable Infrastructures announced 2 projects, one in Eastern Canada with one in the U.S. Total Fiber Recovery has one in the East and has not picked a location for the other one. Empire Recycled Fiber has announced in Southeast PA, and there's several others that have not been announced, and there's little information on them. So North America is the fiber basket of the world. We have the longest and strongest accessible wood fiber in the world is grown in the US and Canada. And softwoods such as Douglas fir, western hemlock, southern yellow pine, and other species provide the wood fiber to produce high quality paper products we use. And the North American paper industry relies on a combination of new wood and recovered paper to maximize the natural resources and cost effectively produce paper products. And because we have a higher percentage of virgin fiber in our paper and board than the rest of the world, our grades of recovered paper are highly sought after for their strength. So I thank you for your attention, and we'll have a chance to go on to questions, and I'll get out of my screen share here.
Perfect timing. Thank you, Bill. Great. It's now 1:31. So, I mean, we do have time, or we don't have time for questions here. So I would probably, I would say that the best option for us is to kind of exit out of this chat session and enter into the networking session. But before we do that, and we can start a discussion there about perhaps some of these global impacts on and what they mean for Saskatchewan. I would like to thank K-Lite Recycling again as the sponsor of this session. And of course, Jim Puckett and Bill Moore for those excellent presentations on a global perspective. Certainly something that we all deal with and work with every single day. So it's great to have a larger viewpoint. So thank you, gentlemen. We appreciate you coming.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thanks. And we'll